Hundreds of pro-democracy protesters are clashing with police at a besieged university in Hong Kong. Demonstrators set fire to portions of the college, where hundreds of people are believed to be barricaded inside. Police are warning that they will use live rounds if they need to contain the crowds. CNN's Anna Coren has been live on the ground for us in this dangerous and breaking situation. Anna, what's the situation at this hour?
Well, Alison, we are still here with the protesters on the streets, several blocks from the Polytechnic University, where those hundreds of protesters are trapped. A short time ago, police just fired canister after canister of tear gas. We could hear just the pounding. And now, as you can see, these protesters have formed a front line. There are bricks in front of them. The riot police are just ahead, maybe 100 meters. Okay, they've set a shop alight. That's what they're looking at. They have been throwing petrol bombs non-stop. And we can see them. They just walk around with their petrol bombs and then light them and throw them at police. And then officers retaliate with rounds and rounds of tear gas. Rubber bullets are also being fired. But this is a game of cat and mouse, Alison. This is now what happens on the streets of Hong Kong. And many of these protests have turned out to try and divert attention from the university. They're hoping that this will attract police resources away from the university and that those inside will be freed. But the police have cordoned it off. There is no way in, no way out. They have told protesters inside the university that they must surrender. Otherwise, they will have to take over the university. Now, riot police are just moving into position. We're expecting them to either charge, which is one of the tactics. Okay, okay. No. All right, yeah, no tear gas. I know, it's tear gas. But it can sometimes be a little bit close for tear gas. And what is extraordinary, Alison, is that these protesters, they are armed with umbrellas. They are armed with umbrellas and they are taking on the police. This is what is unfolding on the streets of Hong Kong now on a daily basis. Okay, we're just going to get out of here.
Get out of here, they're coming. The
Sorry, Alison.
And so, Anna, those are tear gas canisters that we're seeing right now being lobbed from the police.
So that's the fires of petrol bombs, and yes, police are just firing. You can hear the. Okay, just let's move back. Let's move back. Okay, all right. No, they are. All right, let's go back. This is when the police charge. Okay, go. Okay, we're all okay. We're okay. We're okay. Okay.
And
all right, let's get in here.
You and your crew safe. Keep you and your crew safe, and if you can,
no, we're good. We're good.
Tell us what we're seeing there, which is that the protesters are hurling what you're calling petrol bombs, the Molotov cocktails, and the police are now moving or charging, and they are firing tear gas. Go ahead.
Okay, Yep, that's right. And you can see dozens and dozens of riot police moving in. The protesters, Brad, if I can just move our camera, several hundred meters away. And this is the game of cat and mouse that is continually playing out on the streets of Hong Kong. And it really is just quite extraordinary. One of the largest financial centres in the world has been reduced to this.
And obviously this is a dangerous and really nerve-wracking situation because, as I think you've reported, the police have threatened to use live rounds if necessary in terms of crowd control. So you just don't know what's going to unfold next.
Yeah, absolutely. They've been firing rubber bullets, but over the weekend, and again, the police reiterated today during their daily news conference that they would use live rounds against protesters. We know that police have shot at protesters. They have fired at protesters when they felt that their life has been threatened. Well, police are now saying that they will shoot protesters if they are the target of attacks. And And that is what protesters have been doing. This is how they express themselves. This is how they fight back. They hurl these petrol bombs. And look, we were up on the campus yesterday, Alison, with these university students who had stockpiled petrol bombs, who'd stockpiled the bricks. They'd smashed up the bricks. They were putting these bricks and petrol bombs in catapults and then firing them at the police below the university. One of the police officers was hit with a bow and arrow, and we saw plenty of archers on that rooftop who said that this is the way that they are defending their university. As far as they are concerned, Alison, these people consider themselves at war with the Hong Kong police. And this is which, it begs the question, what is the off-ramp? What is the end game for the protesters and for the police in that matter? This has been going on for almost 6 months. And every single weekend and now daily on the streets, these protests, these violent clashes are taking place.
And Anna, these are pro-democracy protesters, which begs the question, what has been the U.S. response to what they're seeing on these streets overnight?
We're just going to move out, John, because it looks like the riot police have moved, and we might head down to where the protesters are. But your question in relation to the pro-democracy, these people who want democracy, many of them are young, John. They've only ever lived under the one country, two systems policy. And they feel that China is encroaching on their civil liberties. They have told me that they would rather die than live under China. And in their eyes, even though Hong Kong is supposed to be handed back to mainland China in 2047, these kids do not identify as being Chinese. They see themselves as Hong Kongers, and they are wanting to preserve their way of life, so much so that they are willing to take to the streets and risk their lives. It really is quite extraordinary, and they don't feel that the government is listening. That is their major frustration, John.
And do they feel that the U.S. government is listening and watching?
Sorry, that was your question. The U.S. government, they've obviously appealed time and time again. Okay, these are the raptors who are coming now down the street. These are the ones who actually make arrests, and there are protesters just here. The U.S. government, Alison, they have time and time again appealed to the U.S. government, and obviously the Human Rights and Democracy Act that has been passed by the House of Representatives, it's waiting to be passed by the Senate. Well, we heard from President Trump, who said he may not allow it to go ahead. Now, for the people here in Hong Kong, for the people taking to the streets, for the people fighting for democracy, they feel like that is just a huge slap in the face. They feel that America is the last bastion when it comes to democracy and fighting for democracy and the freedom of speech. So really, if that act is not passed, then who is going to help these protesters? That is the question, Alison.
Anna Corin, thank you very much for being on the ground there for us. We wouldn't be able to see this without your reporting. Please stay safe. Obviously, we will keep tabs on you and come back as warranted.
And noting here, those protesters waiting for some kind of voice of support from the United States, it has not come and does not appear to be coming as long as the trade negotiations are going on.
Madam President, today, brave men and women, boys and girls, are standing up and demanding that the Chinese Communist Party protect Hong Kong's autonomy, protect free speech, and defend human rights. Despite these peaceful protests, the Chinese Communist Party is fighting back with brutality and violence. The police brutality that we've seen and the Chinese Communist Party's larger assault on the people of Hong Kong has been shameful. Just this past weekend, the Hong Kong police began attacking young, innocent students who were peacefully protesting that brutality. They were attacked with tear gas and rubber bullets. These students' college campus was turned into a war zone where no one was safe. And today we have the opportunity to tell the world these blatant human rights attacks and this campaign to bully Hong Kong into submission are not okay, and America won't stand for it. Last month, I traveled to Hong Kong. I met with many brave men and women who are standing up. I met with the dissidents, the pro-democracy protesters who are speaking out for Hong Kong's autonomy and free speech and basic human rights. Along with them, I dressed in all black to express my solidarity with the peaceful protesters who have taken to the streets. Right now, in response to that protest, tear gas, sponge grenades, rubber bullets are being fired at university campuses in Hong Kong. In Xinjiang province, millions of detained Uyghurs and other religious minorities are languishing in concentration camps. And across China, Falun Gong practitioners are captured and murdered so that the Communist Party can harvest their organs. Freedom from the brutality and the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party is the battle cry of the dissidents in Hong Kong. What have they been waving American flags, and what have they been singing? The American national anthem, reciting quotations from our founding fathers who risked everything for freedom in America. Madam President, I want to thank Senators Rubio and Cardin. I want to thank Senator Risch and Senator Menendez and all of the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, both Republicans and Democrats, who have joined together. This legislation the Senate is preparing to pass, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, is important legislation. It is bipartisan legislation. I urge the House to take it up and pass it promptly. The people in Hong Kong are engaged in an existential battle for liberty. And they should know, and they will know by our actions in just a few moments, that the people of America stand with Hong Kong. I yield the floor.
Is the Senate a quorum call?
It is not.
Mr. President, in a moment here, as my colleagues gather, we hope to be able to pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. I want to first acknowledge all the people who worked so hard on it, our staffs, obviously, and in addition, Senators Cardin, Risch, and Menendez, and over 50 co-sponsors, many of whom will join us here this evening. I also want to thank Leader McConnell and Schumer for their support in helping us get here. I want to thank Chairman Crapo, who has helped us make some important changes at the end that will make the sanctions easier to implement. A lot of people have been watching on the news the protests that are going on in Hong Kong and wondering perhaps the depths of what it's all about. When the United Kingdom handed Hong Kong over to China, they signed an agreement. It's known as the Joint Declaration, and it basically guaranteed a high degree of autonomy and freedom to the people of Hong Kong. As a result of that agreement, the United States has treated commerce and trade with Hong Kong differently than it has commercial and trade activity with the mainland of China. But what's happened over the last few years is the steady effort on the part of Chinese authorities to erode that autonomy and those freedoms. The most recent protests really began with a proposal to pass an extradition law that would allow the Chinese government to basically arrest and extradite someone in Hong Kong over to the mainland. And there was a huge pushback against that. And those protests emerged as a result of it. And even after the Hong Kong government pulled out from pursuing that agreement or pursuing that law, the protests have continued because the people of Hong Kong see what's coming. They see the steady effort to erode the autonomy and their freedoms. And the response by the Hong Kong authorities under tremendous pressure from Beijing is violence and repression. So far, over 5,000 people have been arrested in Hong Kong. The youngest was 12 years of age, the oldest 82. Hundreds more have been injured by both violence committed by police authorities, but also by street gangs, criminals, thugs, empowered and encouraged by Chinese authorities. And this effort by China to exert control and remove autonomy continues unabated. Just some examples. There was a law that was passed that banned wearing masks. And a Hong Kong court ruled that that ban was unconstitutional. Well, today, the so-called National People's Congress in Beijing ruled that Hong Kong courts have no authority, no power to review Hong Kong government legislation. Under pressure from Beijing, Hong Kong government's threatening to cancel the November 24th elections. Elections, by the way, that China's been interfering in. They've pushed to ban critics like Joshua Wong from running. 7 candidates who are running have been attacked by street gangs during this campaign. 2 candidates have been arrested while campaigning. And now, in the latest move, China's pushing the Hong Kong government to pass what they call a new national security law, a law that would allow them to arrest political critics and opponents. And if this passes, if that happens, that's the very definition of control and de facto proof of all loss of autonomy. And by the way, China's also pushing for something very ominous. They call it patriotic education. What China's really pushing for in Hong Kong is moving from one country, 2 systems to one country, 1 system, the Chinese system. And so the bill that we'll bring up here in a moment with tremendous bipartisan support requires 5 quick things that I'll touch on. First, its most important element is it requires the Secretary of State to annually certify whether Hong Kong warrants being treated differently than China. If Hong Kong is no longer autonomous, and that's the rationale for different treatment, then they should no longer receive that treatment. It says that students in Hong Kong shouldn't be barred from entering the United States, getting a visa to study here, for example, because they've been the subject of a politically motivated arrest or detention. It says that for the next 7 years, the Secretary of Commerce is going to report on whether export controls and sanction laws are being enforced by the government of Hong Kong, or whether China is using Hong Kong to evade, as a backdoor to evade export controls and sanctions. It says that if Hong Kong ultimately returns and passes that extradition bill that China wants, the president has to present a plan to protect Americans from this law. And last but not least, it requests that the president identify, or it mandates that the president identify and sanction foreigners. The president determines, based on credible information, foreigners who are responsible for extraditions, for arbitrary detention, for torture, for forced confessions inside of Hong Kong, or any other human rights violations in Hong Kong. And by the way, would also allow blocking their assets of these persons if those assets are located here in the United States. And so in a moment here, as we continue to gather, I know we're awaiting the arrival of a companion legislation. I would yield the floor because I know we have a lot of important sponsors that are here that want to speak on this subject.
Senator from Arkansas.
The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is really about promises, making promises and keeping promises. Unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has a long history of making promises but not keeping them. You can ask a rice farmer from Stuttgart, you can ask a software programmer from Fayetteville, a factory worker from Fort Smith, a Christian missionary from Searcy. In this case, China promised in 1984 that it would uphold the one country, 2 systems approach to Hong Kong when it took over in 1997. It promised to preserve the freedoms that have made Hong Kong distinctive, the freedom to practice one's religion as one sees fit, to speak one's mind and to participate in the political process. But that's just another promise they're on the verge of breaking. Apparently, the one country, 2 systems approach can't satisfy Beijing's rapacious appetite. They look and covet at Hong Kong's wealth, and they fear and loathe its freedom, which stands in shining contrast to the Orwellian oppression on the mainland. In fact, they fear that mainland Chinese might look across the bay and start to get ideas. So the Chinese Communist Party has been breaking its promises to Hong Kong and to the world, waging a brutal campaign to absorb Hong Kong into its dystopian high-tech dictatorship. Hong Kongers are bravely resisting in the face of this kind of escalating violence. In recent days, Hong Kong security forces have shot a protester in the stomach. They've trapped hundreds of students in a university using rubber bullets and tear gas on them, and they've threatened them with mass arrest. Beijing's propagandists have been hinting that even harsher measures are on the way. An article in the party-controlled China Daily argues that Beijing must accelerate Hong Kong's integration with the mainland and then re-educate Hong Kongers just like they were doing on a mass scale to 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps in Xinjiang. So I said this in the summer when the protests started. Let me say it again. It would be a grave mistake of historic proportion, surpassing the massacre of Tiananmen Square, if Beijing or to impose martial law, occupy, or otherwise crack down on Hong Kong. But the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is about more than China making and breaking promises. It's also about the United States finally enforcing China's promises. We have a shot to avert catastrophe, protect the people of Hong Kong, and to finally enforce Beijing promises or hold them accountable for breaking those promises. Very soon, the Senate will pass this legislation on a unanimous, bipartisan basis to give you a sense of sentiment in the Congress. This legislation will require the Secretary of State to certify Hong Kong's autonomy from the mainland each year. Otherwise, they will lose the special privileges that U.S. law currently grants to Hong Kong. The bill will freeze the assets and travel of officials who are responsible for abducting Hong Kongers, like the journalists and booksellers who have been vanishing without a trace since 2017. And it will ensure that pro-democracy protesters can get visas to the United States despite their specious arrests. But if the Chinese Communist Party will simply pull back from the brink, if they will keep their promises, if they will respect the one country, two system approach, none of that will happen. So Beijing has a promise. Keep its promises, or give Americans and the world one more reason to treat China like an outlaw regime. So choose wisely, Mr. General Secretary Xi.